My guest is John Nathan, Japan expert, translator of such luminaries as Kenzaburo Oe and Yukio Mishima, documentarian, and Takashima professor of Japanese cultural studies here at UCSB. His new book is Living Carelessly in Tokyo and Elsewhere, a memoir. John Nathan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me aboard.
Now, I was thinking about the idea of what I call Japanophilia, the affinity for the attraction to things Japanese, and it seems like more the rule than the exception with modern kids in America. When you got into Japan, this was the early 60s, how common was it to be interested in Japan as an American young person? Not
particularly. As a matter of fact, that's probably one of the reasons that I was drawn to it so powerfully, in honesty. It was really like, as I said in my book, sort of having a pet monkey, because there are lots of kids studying Albert Camus and this and that and the other thing, and Western philosophy and so on, but almost no one was really studying or particularly interested in Japan in those days.
And was it the case that, you say this in your book, but that just seeing one character drawn was what led you into this whole life of Japan?
Well, that's in an earlier draft of my memoir, I had written the truth about that, which I set that story down with as much panache as I could manage, and then I said, is that really what happened? I wonder if it is. I've told the story 50 times, and now that I actually write it on the page, I question it. And, like so much in a memoir, which is really not so much about memory as it is about persona, it turns out, when you actually write one. I think that's what happened, but it may be an embellishment, to be honest with you. Certainly, these two characters, I do remember being drawn for me on a napkin by a Japanese kid who had come to Harvard. And it was a very unusual word. This word that in English is whitlow, meaning an infection, but beneath the fingers and the toes and the nails. And I do think at some point very early on, I stared at these two pictures, basically, and thought to myself, my God, these two things mean that. In that case, I want to learn more about this language. I think there's some truth in that. Whether that's the only thing that impelled me to go and check out a Japanese language class, I couldn't say.
But you did check out Japanese language, and how did that draw you into the fold of...
It's just one of those things. I watched this guy who was very, very fluent, a professor named Guglielmo, talking about a Japanese writer and chalking these characters on a blackboard with tremendous energy and adroitness, and something just took me over, Now, of course, if that had been a Chinese teacher, I would have had a totally different life, I believe. Of course, the same Chinese characters, but if this had been a fellow teaching Chinese literature, I might well have signed up for Chinese studies. But it was a Japanese teacher, as it turned out. And then I began taking the language, and I remember, having intended to be a Latinist and to study Greek and Russian and a bunch of other things, I fell in love with this language very early on in my study of it. And what's the explanation for that? I couldn't possibly tell you. But by the time I was through 4 years of school, I was really sort of fanatically committed to and submerged in the pursuit of this impossibly difficult language, for sure.
The phrase you used just now and in the book, Japanese was my pet monkey. What does that mean?
I remember that when I was a young man, when I was a boy, really, my father, who was a painter, rudely transplanted the family from very familiar New York to totally unfamiliar Tucson, Arizona, which was really a kind of a frontier Twilight Zone-like environment, and I felt very out of place in it. The only thing that I knew how to do better than the other kids was to raise my hand first when a question was asked in class, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. I didn't know how to hunt. I didn't know how to kill wild boar with bows and arrows and so on. I remember feeling that I needed something to distinguish myself that would somehow both distinguish and protect me, and for some reason I thought I would love to have a pet monkey, because no one else had a pet monkey, and that would make me special, and maybe that would make me the object of admiration, or at least interest, instead of derision, which is what I was feeling. So at the time, my parents didn't indulge me. I didn't end up with a pet monkey, but looking back on my career in Japan, I have to acknowledge, and did in this book, that there was at least an element about this choice of something so, at the time, arcane, exotic, unfamiliar to everyone, which certainly it was, that played into my attraction to the subject. It made me feel a little more confident than if I had tried to study Henry James and found myself in competition with the people around me who are these prep school boys, who had done a lot of literature when I hadn't. So that's what I meant by my pet monkey.
Would you have done the same had you been born, say, in 1980? And
Not
it was
at
a
all.
More normal thing? Oh.
Good question. I was about to say that. In 1980, and even more, after 1980, certainly, this element of exoticism and unfamiliarity probably wouldn't really have surrounded as an aura the choice of Japanese studies, and I, in the same circumstances, would have had to do something else. I would have had to take Old Norse or something similar, maybe to feel that I was equally in an unfamiliar clime, you know?
Now, learning Japanese, how long did it take you as a Westerner to get to the point where you could convincingly speak it to a native Japanese? Or do you ever get to that point where they...
Oh, yeah, of course I did, yeah, but it took me a very long time. I mean,
I should say, does a Westerner get to that point where they can pass as a good Japanese speaker to anybody in Japan?
Well, I think there are a few Westerners who have. Japanese is a very difficult language to learn to speak for a variety of reasons I won't get into right now, but I studied for 3 years at Harvard, and when I got to Tokyo, although I could read with difficulty modern stuff, when I would ask a question and the answer would come back to me too fast. It took me a long time to develop what I would call a fluency. It was 3 years at the University of Tokyo as a regular student listening to lectures that really helped me break through that initial wall and get to the place where I could really handle the language. And then after that, of course, I studied frantically, urgently, all the time, single-mindedly, attempting to, of course, learn it well enough so that the Japanese would stop pointing fingers at me and saying, "Oh, isn't that charming that you're trying to speak our language?" It used to drive me if crazy. So I had that additional incentive, which people had in the 60s and even 70s, of being made to feel ridiculous for even attempting to break through into this culture by means of fluency in the language, which helped me somehow work even harder at it, and eventually I became very fluent.
The classic story you hear from people who go to Japan or people who talk about going to Japan is that no matter how good a Westerner speaks it, you will always find people in Japan who pretend not to understand you. Has that situation come along since you first went to Japan?
Well, when I was first there in the early 60s, of course, that situation obtained, dramatically wherever you would go. And we'd get into a taxi cab and tell the fellow where to go in perfect Japanese, and he would turn to the Japanese companion and ask them, "Where do you want to go?" Or you try and buy railroad tickets, and people would wave their hand in front of their faces, which was the signal for "can't understand," and call for an interpreter and so on. That's changed a very considerable deal today, of course, over the decades. I would have to say that the Japanese are still surprisingly parochial about their international understanding that everybody can get by just fine if they, in their culture as they can in ours. And you still find, I still encounter people who give you the standard, do you use chopsticks? How amazing. Can you read the little phonetic scripts? How amazing. You don't read characters, I'm sure, and so on and so forth. But it's much, much better than it used to be.
What does that say about Japanese identity, about what they think about themselves, the fact that they assume Westerners or foreigners shouldn't be able to grasp their language like they can?
What it says, in my own view, is that they are very uneasy about their own identities as Japanese, and that there's a kind of a defensiveness which is put up between themselves and outsiders attempting to break through into some kind of peer standing or par with them. You talk about the French are very arrogant. You can never speak French well enough to satisfy a Frenchman, but that comes from a very different part of the brain, it seems to me, having to do with a certain kind of cultural arrogance than the Japanese situation, where everything is kind of shaky, where identity itself, particularly in moments of crisis, are shaky.
Now, how did you get to the point where you were translating literature? I know that's a long story, but what brought you to that occupation?
I always was in awe of writers and of literature in general, and the translator in those days seemed to me to be someone who, how can I put this, was sort of in a halfway house between normalcy and the wild, absurd craziness of artistry, so to speak. And I dreamed, that it would be a wonderful thing to do, to be as a means of becoming a writer. The translation would be a very challenging and worthwhile métier. In my own case, I was very lucky. I saw the opportunity to do this in a big-time way, sort of dropped into my lap. I had done a few stories and tried them and published them in a small quarterly publication called the Japan Quarterly, when a fellow from Alfred A. Knopf named Harold Strauss came to Japan searching for a new translator for Yukio Mishima. Donald Keene, who had been his translator, was working on something else and had declined to do the next book. Knopf had a deadline and an obligation to Mishima to get a new book out, and Harold was the only person in American publishing in those days who knew any Japanese at all. There's a lot of controversy among us about how much he actually knew, but he pretended to know a lot, certainly. I was in Japan sort of searching around, and someone said, well, there's this American guy who rides his motorcycle to the University of Tokyo every day, seems to speak with, rapid-fire, surprising fluency. You ought to meet him. So I got this phone call from Harold Strauss saying to me, how would you like to meet Yukio Mishima? And of course, I was overwhelmed by that and did meet him, and one thing led to another, and I became the translator of The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea when I was 23 as a result of this really very good fortune that I had.
Yukio Mishima, we think of, at least in this country, we think of the guy who committed suicide, after trying to rouse the Japanese army. But what sort of a guy did you know at that time? Because, of course, it was much earlier than when he had formed his own paramilitary outfit and all that.
Well, creepily, Chris, it wasn't that much earlier, believe it or not. It was. I met Mishima in 1963, and he killed himself in 1970. So it was only 7 years, an amazingly steep incline that he climbed between that moment and the final end, although there were many elements about him at the time that I didn't even know very well, which were pointing in that direction. I mean, the man that I met and knew was, the most flamboyantly international Japanese artist, known around the world. He'd flown in a jet fighter plane. He'd conducted a symphony. He'd been to America and all around the world. He wore British suits. He lived a very gaudy, showy life. And, of course, he wrote an extraordinary wrote prolifically, both popular potboiler novels and serious ones. This was, by 1963, he had already created some of his best works. And so he was a flamboyant, famous personage, on the Japanese scene, who was very good at letting each person he was involved in see about him only that aspect of him that he wanted to reveal. So each person had a different sense of who Mishima was. Consequently, when he killed himself 7 years later, there were lots of people, including me, who thought, my God, I thought I knew this man, but look what he's gone and done. How can I possibly account for this?
It's so interesting you say that he was international in that way, and yet is known now as the ultimate nationalist in some ways.
Absolutely, the ultra nationalist, really. I mean, there is, of course, a huge contradiction there, and there are complex reasons, I think, some of which I understand, and undoubtedly many which I don't, that drove him into this position. If I had to sum it up in a word, and I actually wrote a whole book about this particular conviction of mine, I would say that he had created for himself a situation in which he was able to feel that he was a warrior on a battlefield dying a martyr's death, and that the only way he could do that in a weak, piping time of peace, to quote Richard III, was to create a kind of mini insurrection and simulate a situation in which he could be a warrior killing himself, committing harakiri. So that, of course, takes you in a very ultra-nationalist direction, obviously, even though, up to the day before, he would have conversations with Donald Keene and many, many West. He was not a xenophobe by any means at all, except in this guise and pose that he sort of took on to himself.
To get off on a little bit of a tangent, Japanese nationalism and death, why are they so intertwined?
I suppose I would say that when you look at Bushido, the way of the samurai, the way of the Japanese warrior, what you can really say about that is that it's one of the world's most highly embellished and complex death trips. The standard proprietary protocol book for the samurai, In the Shadow of the Fallen Leaves, Hagakure, which Mishima actually wrote a lot about, begins with a long section on the warrior's constant day-to-day, hour-to-hour readiness to die, and to die nobly, bravely, and heroically. And, of course, they carry rouge in their little brocade badge so that in case you're sliced, you won't look pale at the time of death, and so on and so on. So death in the cause and the death of a martyr, particularly, but not exclusively, had always been one of the principal both goals and virtues in the way of the warrior. So that's, I think, sort of a much too shallow, to be sure, but a sort of schematic explanation of the connection between death and ultranationalism.
How did you approach the project of translating the Mishima novel? What did you think you were in for versus what you actually found the task to entail?
That's a great question. This took place, about 45 years ago, right? Sure. I was very excited. I know that. I went out and bought myself the same Mont Blanc pen that all the Japanese big shots used. It cost about $200. My total pay on the Mishima job was $400, so I spent half of it on this fat cigar-like fountain pen and a big notebook so that I could feel just like Mishima. I worked at night. I have to say that I took to this very naturally from the very beginning. I read this material with excitement and some very considerable fluency, and then I began to transform it into English, and that process from the beginning, particularly in Mishima's case, always felt very natural to me. I can't really tell you a story about how I expected one thing and found the other to be the case. I didn't have expectations. I just had this experience which I thrived on and relished as I went along. And, of course, it's much easier on some level, obviously, to translate someone else's novel than it is to write one of your own. That's for sure. And the fact of the matter is that just now, 45 years later, I'm finally writing a novel and beginning to consider that maybe I can be a novelist too now that I've grown up. So that shows you how much easier it is to do one than the other in my case.
The job of translation, it's not something that people generally know about, the nuts and bolts of it. I think there's a perception that the translator, being fluent in the original language, reads it, and then there's a line direct from their brain that translates it, and their hand just writes it out. And I know it's not that simple, and you know it's not that simple. Why is it not that simple?
First of all, even in languages that are related to English, let's say, Romance languages, for example, there is an enormous chasm separating the mode of expression, the genius of expression in, say, French or German, from the mode of expression in English, the intentionality to communicate in English. So it's not as though there's ever a simple one-to-one equivalency that the translator need merely invoke and mechanically create. When you're talking about moving across a gulf between a language like Japanese and a language like English, now we're talking about a stellar gulf. It's like the distance between the stars. So basically you have to read. All translation begins with reading. Ideally, you would be the writer's best reader. Now, that's unlikely, but you should be able to read everything which is in the text and everything which is, including things that the writer didn't intend and so on, so that it sings to you in exactly the kind of melody that he was hearing himself as he wrote. And then there's what I've always thought of as a kind of a mystical transitional phase, the bridge phase, where you allow this music to sort of go through some kind of filter in your linguistic and creative self and begin to reformulate it basically in English with equivalents and so on. And then, of course, the third part of this is, if reading ideally, and then this mystical sort of part, is that ideally the translator should be as good a writer in his own language as the original author is in his, which is, of course, very, very unlikely and, if not impossible. I mean, I used to tell myself for many, many years I nourished this fiction, sort of a comforting fiction to me, that even if James Joyce had known Japanese as miraculously well as I did, he wouldn't be as good a translator because I had a special translator's gift. And I must tell you that, quite a while ago, the magic of that incantation kind of went away, and I realized that was complete nonsense. And then, in fact, if James Joyce had known Japanese as well as I do, he would be a much better translator than I, of Kenzaburo Oe in this case, because he was a much greater writer. So, it's one of those kinds of things. But certainly, there's very little about it that is mechanical or automatic. That's for sure, which is why, sophisticated as the new computer technology for translation has become and will undoubtedly become, I think that ultimately it's going to be very unlikely that you get great translations of, for example, great poetry or great fiction, great prose, processed by a machine.
Now, I read a lot of Japanese literature, but I don't know Japanese, so I'm reading it in translation. I tend to follow the translators that I think do a good job because maybe they'll do justice more so to an author. What do you think, typically, in the real world as it actually is practiced, separates a good Japanese translator, a serviceable translator of Japanese literature from a great one?
Good question. If I gave you 4 volumes of American fiction, one by Hemingway, one by Henry James, one by however many, let's say Hemingway, James, and Joyce, for example, or Steinbeck or something, and you opened them in the middle of the book, you would immediately discern striking stylistic differences among them, and you would see something that was like a kind of a voice print of a particular, that's called style. If you open 3 volumes of Japanese fiction, you will find the same thing. Tanizaki writes has an unmistakable style, as does Mishima, as does Oe Kenzaburo. If I were to give you 4 volumes of Japanese literature in English and ask you to open them, I dare say that you might be able to distinguish by theme. If what you saw was about feet, you would say, oh, this is Tanizaki. If you saw some being kissed, which invoked images of death, you might say Mishima, and so on. But you would be at pains. You would be in a real fix if you tried to see an absolutely unmistakable stylistic differentiation among these 3, 4, 6, 10 works. That's where the crux of it comes. Recreating the author's voice is the ultimate task, in my own view, of the translator. How do you do that? Who knows? Can you do it? Yes, if you understand style and have style of your own. So all I can say is that when you open something in English that's been translated from Japanese and get a sense that there is a real stylistic coherency and presence in what you're reading, then you can probably be sure that you're in the hands of a better or even a greater than a less great or mediocre translator.
You've translated Oe, you've translated Mishima. What were the biggest differences in those jobs?
Great question. Mishima is someone who had tremendous envy for and a longing to belong at the center of Japanese things. That is to say, he wanted to be part of a tradition of aristocracy and elegance that he actually wasn't by birthright, but one. Therefore, his language was a kind of a model extraordinaire of Japanese operating at its most traditional and appropriate brilliance. That means that when you translate Mishima, if you find the right little stone, you can put it into a mosaic and it will fit. It will click in because he's doing to the Japanese language something which is brilliant but which is not violent. Oe Kenzaburo, like many people on the outside of things, including Camus, for example, was at pains to destroy the Japanese language. As a matter of fact, he would write and then he would rewrite in such a way as to completely unpack and tear apart, so that he would and then rebuild in rhythms and formats and syntaxes which were in fact very, very unsuitable to inappropriate for the language. So that's much, much harder to do, because when you try to recreate the voice of Oe in English, you have issues of piling syntax with these heaping things that will break the syntactical back of the English sentence, and so on. So Mishima ultimately is much easier. If you're just patient and know some words, chances are you'll get a mosaic that looks like Mishima. With Oe, it's a very different subject matter.
Is it true what I hear when I talk to people? They say that Oe, in Japanese, he writes Western, they say.
Oe has been accused of reeking of butter, batakusasa, which is the way of saying foreignness, from the moment he began to write as a junior in the University of Tokyo. And of course, it's true that this is a man who was immensely, deeply read in Western languages: French, German, English, now Italian, Greek, you name it. And it's also true, as I mentioned to you, that he was trying to break down the Japanese language into something else. For example, Tanizaki, when he read early Oe, said, if this is Japanese, I'm putting my fountain pen away. So it's certainly true that Oe writes a Japanese language which is a brutalization in some sense, but is that Western? I would say certainly not. It in fact, is a language which incorporates rhythms and syntaxes that evoke Western structure, but it is entirely his own. And to call it just an imitation of Western language is nonsense.
Give me your impressions of the literary climate of 60s Japan, because it sounds like a wonderful scene to be in, and you were right there.
Literary Japan in the 1960s was a very, very exciting moment in Japanese literary history, for sure. There's this Japanese word, the bundan, which means the literary community. And the bundan in the 1960s was in its heyday. You know, you had all of the old great guys still around: Tanizaki, Kawabata, Mishima. And then you had a whole group of new post-war writers, younger guys, who were there and very exciting. And there really was a sense of fraternization and of kind of an understanding of the difficult, lonely, challenging task that writing was. And so when you were around these people, observing or actually submerged in, or at least having access to this community, it was a very exciting experience. Today, the bundan scarcely exists at all. I mean, Japanese writers, may occasionally meet each other at parties and so on, but there's no more brotherhood there's no more community of creative writers. And of course, there aren't as many great writers anyway. So, the writing community was exciting. There were more talented people alive and at work, I think, in Japan together at that time than at any time before or since.
Do you think you could hazard a guess as to why that disintegration happened?
Well, some of it has to do, I think, with what we might just call zeitgeist. There are times in every literary history when you get more, greater, and more important writers than at other times. The society, for complex reasons, nurtures them or gives them things to say or stimulates them or provokes them or whatever. So it's really hard for me to really figure out why the 60s should have been as cohesively exciting as they in fact were, except what I could say is that the war was a tremendous discontinuity and a tremendously frustrating impediment, damming up of literary energy. And that broke open in 1945, and it's possible to say that it took 15 years for that unleashing of tremendous energy and vision and dedication and excitement to sort of reach maturation, which it did sort of in the 60s. I mean, I'm just hazarding this explanation, but it seems to me to be not entirely implausible.
In your new book, you discuss your friendship with Abe and Oe, Kobo Abe, I should say, and Oe, who were friends at that time, and then you were their friend as well. What was it like to be the third point of that triangle?
It was really unforgettable and amazing. Oh, boy. I mean, Abe and Oe had this kind of... Abe was sort of like an elder brother figure, maybe 10 years older than Oe, I think. I'm not sure, but something like that. And Abe would scold Oe and reproach him for being careless if he was, or whatever. Oe was actually in awe of Abe for much of that time. I met Abe the first time. Oe brought him to my house. One day, there was a knock on the door, and I opened my door, and there was Oe, and behind him was this Japanese. He said, I want you to meet Kobo Abe. This is an amazing time, when Kenzaburo Oe brings Abe Kobo to your house. That's far out. And Abe, who was always an Epicurean, showed up with this bottle of, I think it was Bulgarian brandy, which he insisted was much better brandy than French brandy. And so we sat around and we talked about identity and Jewish identity, because, as you know, Abe grew up in Manchuria and was there at the end of the war when the Russian Cossacks kind of rode their horses through his house, and had a huge fixation about and obsession with the nature of identity, which is a central theme of what he does. So they were as different as two people could be. Oe was kind of like a country bumpkin, uptight, rigid in many ways individual, whereas Abe was as open and as loosey-goosey as you could imagine. Abe would put on his... this is a little contradictory, I realize, but Abe would put on his special imported Viennese leather driving gloves when he got into his BMW, which at the time was the only BMW in town. And Oe was, of course, riding his son on his bicycle and looked at this with a kind of a combination of dismay and judgment, So stylistically, they were totally different guys, but they were very close, and of course they were very smart, and they loved to talk about literature. So to be sitting around there as the youngster in the group, I was 5 years younger than Oe, and maybe 15 years younger than Abe. I was in my basically mid-20s when this was going on, and I would go to their houses, and they would come, and the wives would be there. We'd just sit around and talk, and I would do a lot of listening. I would also shoot my mouth off, which I'm very embarrassed about when I recall it now, but it was a great way to spend time, I can tell you.
I wanted to ask, what do you think they got from having a young Westerner yourself around?
I was translating Oe at the time. I never really translated Abe Kobo, even though he wanted me to. I did one short story. Something didn't draw me to his work, and it was a little bit awkward, actually, as the years went on, because, a translator was very important to these guys, obviously, and there weren't that many good translators around, and so they knew that I could translate, and that was maybe one of the sources originally of their interest. We had a kind of sympathetic harmony that we shared in. We would talk about things, we would resonate off each other. I wouldn't presume to put myself in their class. But in my own way, I guess I managed to hold up some kind of an end that they enjoyed being around. We just had a good time together, really.
For those just tuning in, my guest is John Nathan, translator, filmmaker, Japan expert, and author of Living Carelessly in Tokyo and Elsewhere. How did you become a documentarian in Japan?
Well, film was another thing that I always knew, even though I had never done it, that I could do. Don't ask me why. I just knew. The first thing I did was a film called Full Moon Lunch, which was a hour-long documentary designed for PBS in this country. And I had this idea to do a trilogy or a tetralogy of films that would take cameras into absolutely ordinary Japanese life more deeply than had ever been done before, and to try to create portraits that would take American audiences, beyond cliche and caricature to the Japanese as just real people like ourselves, equally contradictory, equally wise, equally foolish, what have you. So I managed somehow I just wanted to do this, and my film thing began actually before this. Oe had made me his agent for film scripts, about his books in the United States. And one day when I was at Harvard, the second time around, in the late 60s, in the Society of Fellows I was at the time, I got this, I was forwarded this script written by someone working for Burt Lancaster Productions, which was an American adaptation of A Personal Matter, a novel that I had translated. And I thought it was really lame and literal and plotting. And so I said, okay, I'm in this marvelously enviable position. I have like 2 years to do what I want. I said, I can do better than this. So I scotched that project and began to write my own screenplay about a personal matter. I worked on it for a long time, for about a year, actually. And, of course, the Society of Fellows viewed this as a real, as a decadent digression or descent from the high level I was supposed to be operating on. I remember very clearly this fellow, this marvelous economist named Vasily Leontiev, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist, who was the chairman of the society in those days, came to me one day and said, in his heavy Slavic accent, Mr. Nathan, there's a Yale guy who's applied to get into the society who's also a screenwriter. And I said, oh, that sounds wonderful. What are his chances? And he said, he has no chances. He said, first junior fellow, then butterfly, never other way around, which was Leontiev's way of letting me know that he really didn't think that screenwriting was an avocation that I should be pursuing. In any event, I wrote this thing, took it to New York, and ended up with some agents who liked it. We're going to get it produced, and I wanted to direct it. And they said, I just did. I was just arrogant, I suppose. And they said, no, you can't direct it. And I said, what if I get Teshigahara Hiroshi involved and do it with him? They said, okay. We brought Teshigahara to this country, and the project fell through. But as Teshigahara was leaving to return to Japan, I brought up the idea of making a film about American deserters from Vietnam in the Japanese underground. And 4 months later, he raised the money for that, and we made this film together called Summer Soldiers, which infected me with filmmaking. I guess that's how I should have begun. 5 years later, at Princeton, a professor at Princeton, I thought I'd love to do some more stuff, and I raised money to do this first documentary of mine called Full Moon Lunch, and went to Tokyo with some money, used the same crew that we had worked on with Summer Soldiers, and in the course of a summer, found this marvelous family of caterers in downtown sort of Cockney Tokyo, and shot and wrote and edited this film, which I took back and showed to PBS, and they just said, wow, we'll put it on the air right now. And it was broadcast nationally like a few weeks later. But in those days, I took those sort of things almost for granted. Now I realize that's a good, quite a nice thing to have happened. And I got excellent reviews, and that's how I began.
What impression of Japanese people existed among Americans that you wanted to either contradict with your movies or augment or somehow change that was inaccurate?
I wanted to, in fact, I shouldn't use the word contradict, to enlarge and complicate, deepen the sort of cliched version of the Japanese, which had obtained really since Pearl Harbor, which is here you have an inscrutable, fox-like, dangerous, lethal, humorless little people who run around and smile at you while they're planning to bomb your harbor, which is sort of the way the Japanese were held here. All the rest of it was been left out in the process of caricaturizing that occurred at that time. There was a lot of work to do. It's not as though I had to make little corrections. And it seemed to me, having lived there for many years at that time and loving the Japanese in many ways, and obviously not loving them in others, that a great way to do that would be to show people how these Japanese people really were just in their daily lives. And that's what I set out to do.
Were you surprised by anything you found there? Or did you already know what you were going to get going in, pretty much?
I ended up doing 3 of these things, and each one is a sort of a portrait of either an individual or a family. And in each case, obviously, there were all kinds of levels of revelation that would surface in the process of making a documentary film. So I certainly didn't know what I was going to get going in. I just knew what I hoped I would get, which would be an individual, fascinating, different from American, yet undeniably human, and in that sense familiar portrait of people who were different from ourselves, but very like ourselves, as every man is like every other man.
And the second in the series, Farm Song, what was your idea behind that led you to the farm?
I had been north in this particular part of Japan before, and it always struck me as a very interesting region. This is in the snow country to the north of Tokyo, 300 or 400 miles, and then a little bit inland from Sendai, for example. And it's of course a rural area, and there's a sort of a dark, laconic, uneasy feeling about it, which attracted me, which appeals to me, because it's so different from the sort of Tokyo briskness and brittleness on the surface, which my first family sort of manifested in the film. The notion of what is a Japanese farmer like? I thought, there's someone in Nebraska, who gets on a combine and drives across hundreds of acres of wheat beneath these icy blue ice storms are forming over Indiana or Kansas or whatever. Could they possibly imagine this totally different world, which is nonetheless a farm world? So that's why I wanted to do it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you got Takamitsu, the great composer, to score that one, right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, that was wonderful. He was a friend, of course, a very, very close friend of Oi's. He and Oi were really best friends, and I had known Toru for some time. And I had known him in New York, and I'd known him in Tokyo. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. One day, we were working on the rough cut of this film, and I thought, God, I just called Toru. I said, Toru, would you come and see this? If you like this, would you do the score? And he came in, and we showed him this 2-hour version. He said, I'll do it. And I thought, wow. And then the real wow, of course, came about 5 weeks later. One doesn't, at least John Nathan didn't tell Takamitsu Toru what kind of music he wanted him to write for this movie. So he comes back with this amazing score for about 8 instruments, including bass, flutes, and drums, and all these other wonderful things. I think, by the way, this is one of the greatest film scores that Takamitsu ever wrote. And the most amazing thing is that he had decided were his choices of where to put the music against the picture, which were not my choices. And he would do these things which I would never have dreamed of doing, which just transformed these moments of the film. I remember the first time we actually put the music up against the picture, it was just a breathtaking experience. And what he had done was just so amazing.
I can only imagine. I love his film scores, and if that's the best, I've got to see this film.
Well, I don't know if it's the best, but I'll show it. Have you not seen Farm Song?
No, I can't find it.
I have it. I have it on DVD, everything. I'll show it to you. It's an incredible. I mean, it works amazingly. It really does. And he did just these very, very interesting things. We didn't have a lot of money, and Toru at that time was getting, he was getting huge fees, obviously, so he didn't take that much money for himself, and his instrumentation was relatively minimal, but it's just extraordinary.
He was scoring for Kurosawa and such for that time, wasn't he?
Everybody.
Yeah, so
he's but more importantly than that, I mean, he was the New York Philharmonic was commissioning. I mean, he was at that point a hugely known international composer.
What are your impressions of Takamitsu, the man?
Takamitsu Toru was a tiny, frail man, very modest and retiring in a way, with immense intelligence and creative power that would kind of knock you across the room when you were around with him. He was a philosopher. He wrote very complexly about music and other things a lot. He loved movies. I used to go into movie theaters in Tokyo at one point, and a couple of times in New York even, in the middle of the day, which was something that was frowned on. And there would be like 3 people in the theater, 2 perverts and Takamitsu Toru would be sitting there watching the film in like the 3rd row, because I would come back, I couldn't believe my eyes, and I would sit there, and there would be Toru's on, He was very warm. He was funny. He had a great sense. He was an enchanted presence, I mean, he was enchanted and enchanting, charmed, strangely otherworldly in a funny kind of way, but very there at the same time. It's hard to describe him. I mean, I have difficulty doing it, but just a wonderful and very, very gifted guy.
Now, the 3rd documentary in the series, the Japanese trilogy, a fair departure from the first 2 in terms of scale of subject. Certainly, you move from these 2 families to Katsu Shintaro, the famous movie star,
yes.
Zatoichi.
Yes. Well, you're certainly right to say that it's very, very different. From the Katsu film is very different from the other 2, which will help Americans understand that Japan has its own gangster, Frank Sinatra, Las Vegas mix of stuff. And I thought to myself, who's the most virulent character that I know that crosses these worlds? And I came up, of course, the most vulgar, the most violent, also talented in his way, of course. And that's how I chose the movie star Shintaro Katsu. And, of course, I went to Kyoto with to see him. He was directing himself in those days in this ongoing series of movies about the blind swordsman. And I went to Kyoto with a print of Full Moon Lunch, which he asked me to show him. And I thought, oh, my God, he's going to see this very banal, from his point of view, ordinary thing, and he won't like it. But, in fact, he did like it, and so I made this movie. And it's in many ways the least good of the films, because I was sort of not clear enough that I wanted to be like him somehow as I made the film. And, in fact, I did transform. My voice got deeper. I got to be, I drank more heavily. I ordered people around. I mean, I sort of emulated his style during the making of that film, and there's not enough explanation of distance. There's too much homage, as I think I put it, and too little, critical portraiture. But my purpose was to shock American audiences into the realization that this aspect of Japanese life also existed. When I showed these films to one of my major benefactors in New York, the executive director of the Luce Foundation, who had put a lot of money into them, she rose after about 15 minutes of the Katsu film and walked out of the theater, which was very embarrassing and awkward.
What offended her about that?
Well, I mean, I think Katsu, that film has offended particularly, female audiences. I mean, he's a very vulgar, rude, crude, violent guy with some extremely refined elements as well underneath the surface. But, he's not exactly, and of course many Japanese were offended. They would say, how dare you title a trilogy The Japanese and include a vulgarian like Katsu Shintaro as though he's representative of the Japanese, which is a point that I today, of course, could understand. In those days, I was extremely defensive about that.
Was Katsu thought of in Japan as a vulgarian, widely like that, or was that more of a revelation to Japanese audiences, or was he just widely known as what you showed him as?
When you think of the Rat Pack, that's the way the Japanese related to Katsu, and that's the kind of image that he labored very successfully, to convey and project.
I guess I should be clear on what the reaction was to your documentary. You describe a few negative reactions in the book, but you also describe the positive reactions as well. Who was it that liked it? Who was it that disliked it?
Well, first of all, I don't really know much about Japanese quote unquote reaction to this film, because these films, in fact, have only been shown in a very limited way in Japan since they were made many years ago. So I don't know how the Japanese reacted. Interestingly, as far as Katsu himself is concerned, I thought that Katsu liked this film, and I remember him having said things like, I've discovered myself in here, and I'm a pretty likable guy. And so my dear friend Donald Ritchie, in his memoir, describes sitting around talking to Katsu and saying, I knew Katsu hated Nathan's film and so on. So I would assume that that's probably the truth, because it reveals aspects of himself that he didn't like about himself, maybe. I don't know. Here, the film was critically rather well received. People called it, I think the Christian Science Monitor called it a ribald adventure and personality and so on. And there are some people who enjoyed it, but first of all, I think it's not nearly as good a film as the other two. There's not enough explanation, and as I say, it's too identified with its subject. And I think there were a lot of audiences, particularly in the Academy, who were offended, by this picture. I mean, it's not as though they had to insist that everything be the moon shining on the lake and cherry blossoms and so on, but this went too far in a sense. I was reveling in how far and how over the top it was at the time, with my necklace that I wore and my 3-packet cigarette a day habit and my rough voice and my big hands and my whole thing. I thought that was just great and very groovy, but a lot of people didn't.
What was it like keeping up with Katsu's entourage when you had to film this thing?
It was murder. It was very hard. First of all, the crew that I was working with whom I was very close by this time because we'd already done 2 other films together, were terrified to be working in Kyoto. Because, as they told me, and as my production manager told me, the Kyoto filmmakers were gangsters themselves. And since we were going to be filming a film, if we got in their way and so on, everybody was very uneasy. As it turned out, nothing like that happened. Everything went fine. Katsu would go out all night and charter bars and geisha clubs and kick everybody out and party. And of course, he could do this day after day after day and then go straight to the set, having consumed God knows how much vodka and brandy. So nobody else could do it. We had several people in the hospital in the course of the month that we spent kind of like following him around, and people were just dropping like flies because we had to be sort of on call, for all of this, hoping, as I did, to capture some of this stuff. And nothing a filmmaker hates worse, Japanese filmmaker in particular. At the end of the day, Japanese filmmaker goes home, takes a hot bath, and sits there and plays mahjong with some cigarettes and some brandy and some whiskey, and they do not like to stand around all night waiting to go out into a bar. So I had a lot of difficulty sort of managing my own crew. So it was very difficult.
You have this quote from him in the book. He says, "In Japan, you cannot win." He said to you, what did he mean?
A lot of what Katsu said was spoken through a haze of alcohol and drug-induced, delusion. So it's a little hard for me to tell you exactly what he meant. He was just saying, basically, I think, you seem to be carrying on here as though you belonged, but no foreigner ever really belongs here. I took it in a very different way than that. I mean, I think that's what he was saying. It hit me very hard. And basically, my whispered answer to myself was, I think you hit it right on the head. I'm out of here. Shortly after that, I did leave Japan for a number of years, thinking to put it behind me because I felt that the pet monkey kind of attention that I was earning for myself wasn't genuine and wasn't going to satisfy my insatiable desire to feel special.
What do you think was motivating him during his life? What was he going after?
Well, this is a very complex guy. Remember that he was the eldest son of a great shamisen master, player of this instrument called the shamisen, and who was the founder of his own shamisen school. So Katsu had been raised as a musician, and a very good one, obviously, on this instrument, and was expected by the family, of course, to take over this very lucrative, obviously very, very wealthy sort of empire that his father had built. Interestingly, Teshigahara Hiroshi, the director, was in exactly the same place, except even more grandly, because his father was the head of this school, the Sogetsu Flower. And for that reason, Katsu and Teshigahara had a very close bond. I think that was a principal reason for it. So, he begins that way, and he undoubtedly had some very inflated expectations about himself as an artist. Then he meets James Dean in America, and God knows why, and he decides, I want to be a movie star. So he tries that for a while, it doesn't work, and then he becomes Satoichi, becomes a big shot, and a super-duper movie star, but in a very limited sort of way. And, I would say that Katsu, who was very talented in many ways, was very lacking, ultimately, in clear, long-term vision. I think that his indulgence in, drugs and alcohol and everything else may have made it very difficult for him. I think it was very unmoored. And my principal evidence that I offer for that is that, he had an opportunity to star in a Kurosawa film, which would have been an amazingly wonderful thing for him. Kurosawa had actually cast him as the lead in The Shadow Warriors, as it's known in English. I don't know if you know that movie.
Yeah.
On the first day of the shoot, Katsu shows up on Kurosawa's set with his own movie documentary team. And Kurosawa asks him, what's this? He says, well, I'm going to make a film school, and I want to shoot, because it'll be good for me, myself, working for you. Whereupon Kurosawa immediately fires him and hires Nakadai. Now, any moron would have known that you do not go to Akira Kurosawa's set with your own film crew and tell him that you're going to do something. That's just not the way it works. This was the emperor. It was known in Japan as the emperor. So I think that at that point, Katsu did himself a terrible, career-damaging disservice, because he was a good actor, at least he might have been. And, in Kurosawa's hands, who knows what kind of a performance he might have given and what kind of a leap he might have taken. After all, Mifune, Toshiro Mifune is horrible in any movie but a Kurosawa movie. So that's partial evidence that a great director really does control and create a great actor to some extent. Anyway, so I believe that. So I think, I don't know what ultimately, if you'd asked Katsu, he had a very arrogant and inflated, vision of himself and version of himself and so on. But ultimately, he was a very sad man, and he met a very unfortunate end, in bankruptcy and drug illness and all kinds of other stuff.
How did you run away from Japan when you decided it was time to disassociate yourself a little bit with the country that had been your thing?
Are you saying, how did I do that, or why?
Well, we kind of got an idea of why, but I guess you could go into that. What was the impetus?
What happened was, when my film Summer Soldiers, the film I made with Teshigahara, it opened in New York at the Lincoln Center Film Festival, actually, and did quite well critically, but was a complete and total bust. It ran for like 2.5 weeks at the 68th Street Playhouse, and that was the end of it. One of the many things I regret about my life, I suppose, if I'm in the regret mode, is that I hadn't stuck with it and gone to Hollywood at that point and tried to just keep working. But in fact, I had been offered a job at Princeton at that moment. I had 2 young kids, and I thought, this film isn't going to take me anywhere, so I better do something else. So I became a professor at Princeton, and I was there for 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, 1979 was the year, my wife, Mayumi Oda, at the time, who was a very well-known and wonderful printmaker, among other things, had decided that she wanted to go and move to California from Princeton. And I decided that I would go with her. And I was sort of there were various reasons for deciding that, but I think one of the principal ones was that I wanted to feel as though I was still kind of the head of the household, so that I would go and take her with me. And in fact, that isn't what happened, really. But anyway, I just resigned my Princeton full professorship at that moment, something that Princeton took a while to forgive me for having done, and which was sort of crazy. And that coincided, actually, with this sense of mine that the Japan thing had played out, and Katsu had given me his warning. I made that film in 1978, and this was the following year, and I thought, okay, I'm going to leave this whole deal, and I'm going to go to California, and I'm going to be a regular filmmaker, and I'm not going to do anything to do with Japan. And so I moved, and I threw my credentials away, and it was pretty scary, and I found myself living in Mill Valley, sitting at a typewriter, an IBM Selectric, like 800 million other guys, writing a screenplay, and who was I? I was nobody. Not that I'd been anybody before, but at least I had a Japanese job before. And so that's how that sort of came about, and that went on, for quite a long time. I mean, it took me into a whole new career of filmmaking and writing and so on that had nothing to do with Japan whatsoever until the end of the 80s. So I mean, actually, I was away completely for more than 10 years.
How would you characterize your experience in the American film industry, getting in and what you did there?
Disastrous. I was a bust. I mean, I wrote a screenplay, original screenplay, based loosely on my life in Arizona as a young boy, as a high school kid, with a band of kids from the Arizona School for the Deaf and the Blind. So I had these wonderful jazz musicians who were blind. I called this thing the Gentlemen of Rhythm. I took it to Hollywood, and the writing got me a bunch of jobs. Nobody wanted to produce the film, but I ended up writing television movies for NBC, for everybody, sort of. But only one or two rounds. And then I got paid very well for that. So the first 6 or 8 months, I thought, wow, this is great. And then, of course, I wanted to do something of my own, and that's where I got in trouble. And I couldn't really sell anything, and I couldn't write anything, and I got all sort of tied up in knots about Hollywood and hated it and resented it. And at that point, a business film came along, In Search of Excellence, and I took off on that tangent, began making these long business documentaries. I had no reason to do that, really, and I shouldn't have done it, I suppose, but that's what I did. And for 10 years, that carried me in a totally different direction. As a filmmaker, I ended up directing commercials for AT&T, and that ended up on the Super Bowl and stuff like that. And it was all sort of exciting, but never went anywhere. And so it was aimless, basically. So it was sort of an aimless 10 years of being in the film business.
During that stretch of time, I take it you felt that you weren't working toward any goals that you actually held. Or did you feel like you might have been at the time, but in hindsight you weren't? Or?
No, even at the time, I knew that I was neither pursuing, my interest in Japan, which of course I hadn't lost, really, on the one hand, or really furthering my career as a filmmaker, because I was doing all kinds of movies, but they were business movies and there was television commercials, and it was not necessarily all junk, but it just was stuff that I had no particular urgency about doing, and I didn't feel it was really what I ought to be doing. So that was a very, to me, lucrative and ungratifying 10 years of my life, which I wish I could have back.
And was the idea behind a lot of it, or behind any of it, to just see what you could be without Japan in the picture at all?
Well, originally I think that was my incentive. It was to prove to myself that I didn't need Japan, didn't need the exoticism of Japan to excel. Now, some people would say, gee, John, it seems to me as though what you proved was that you did. I don't know if that's fair. I mean, by some lights, I suppose I was moderately successful in these other things as well. Everybody doesn't get a commercial that he writes and directs on the Super Bowl and stuff like that. But I don't think that the conclusion that I came to was that I couldn't make it without Japan, just that rather that what I was doing was taking me in the wrong direction.
During your time in the academy in America, how satisfying did you find that experience?
Well, apparently I didn't find it nearly as satisfying as I ought to, or I wouldn't have resigned. I mean, I subsequently regretted having resigned. I mean, after all, I was a full professor at Princeton in my low 30s. We had a beautiful place to live, and the students were wonderful. And ultimately, I felt frustrated about being only a college professor. Now, there are many great teachers and great professors who are thrilled to be only college professors, and there are others, of course, who are thrilled to be a college professor some of the time and something else some of the time. And I suppose ultimately that's sort of what I became, thrilled to be a college professor some of the time and hoping to be other things other times. That's how I describe myself now.
And what brought you to make The Colonel Goes to Japan, the documentary on KFC and their campaigns in Japan?
Well, that was another one of these things that just kind of fell my way. There was a very powerful and successful Israeli television producer named Zvi Dorner, was at the time, 1980-81, was producing at WGBH Boston, PBS station at the time, a very interesting series of half-hour programs called Enterprise. Each one was a business story with a real beginning, a real middle, and a real end. Documentary portraits, basically, of the business process. And this was underwritten by Merrill Lynch, doing very well. And out of the blue, he called me one day and said, I've seen your Japan movies, which I like very much. Would you be interested in making a business film for us in Japan? And I said, of course not. I hate business. And then I thought, wait a minute, maybe that would be interesting. So long story short, I went to Japan and found this marvelously funny story about this crazy guy who was running Kentucky Fried Chicken in Tokyo and made a sort of a noir portrait of his attempt to insinuate Kentucky Fried Chicken into the daily lives of the Japanese, which he did very successfully and diabolically.
How does one manage to do that? Because I don't picture KFC as something that, I mean, stereotyping perhaps, a Japanese person would like.
That's a great question, because what determined me to do this particular program, and I went to sort of scout the possibilities, was an advertising session that I was invited to observe, in which the Japanese company Hakuhodo, McCann Erickson Hakuhodo, which is a huge joint venture in Japan at the time, was pitching a new commercial campaign to this fellow, Loy Weston, who ran the American business there. And the campaign was called KFC as Traditional Southern Food Campaign, right? And the big one, they always start with a 60-second deal, which is a great big production number, and they have a storyboard, and the story it tells was of the colonel as a 7-year-old baking some rye bread. And then there's a dissolve, and 20 years later, the colonel's traditional love for food and cuisine in the South transforms into Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they're playing Old Kentucky Home and so on. So the American guy says, who's going to buy that? And they said, well, we've tested it, and we think it turned out to be the most successful food commercial campaign ever staged in Japan, and they sold Kentucky Fried Chicken as traditional Southern aristocratic American food. So what that means is that at that time, the early 80s, this sort of mystique of the United States still obtained. You see, that would never work today as well. Although I must say that not that long ago, about 5 years ago, a student of mine here at UCSB went to Tokyo and sent me back a menu which completely blew my mind, which was Kentucky Fried Chicken's Christmas announcement, in which they advertised that most American families celebrated Christmas Day with a bucket of KFC and all the fixes, and this became the greatest Christmas year gross for KFC in Japan. So it still worked. This was not so long ago. I think it was maybe 6 years ago. I couldn't believe my eyes when I received this menu. So anyway, that was the story that I followed in that film.
What does it say about the Japanese consumer? There may be an analog in the American consumer somewhere, that they buy that particular way of framing the product, that this is an aristocratic Southern thing, that this is a tradition. I guess the focus is tradition. That's what they're pushing.
Well, the focus, I mean, what it says about the Japanese consumer in that time, and of course, if you track Japanese consumer patterns from 1945 to the 90s, you'll see this over and over and over and over again. You know, when Morita, for example, put out the Walkman, the first thing he did was to sell it in the United States. He didn't even release it in Japan. Then he brought it back, and this became known as the boomerang effect. If the Americans loved it, we love it too. So this is something which went on as a social phenomenon in Japan for a long, 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 long time. I think the bloom is very, very much coming off the rose at this point. It has been for some time, actually. But the truth is that, you know, the notion that this is what who knows what they were thinking? Were they thinking Gone with the Wind? You know, on Tara. Maybe they cracked open a tub of KFC, you know, and we want to be like that too, I suppose. You know, it was also sold as an American nourishment package. And one of their campaigns said, you know, American mommies, when they pick their little kids up at preschool and early kindergarten, the first stop on the way home is KFC, where they get them a little. And so the Japanese began releasing these little packages, after school packages. And all the moms would go there and buy their kids this stuff. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing.
especially for something that seems so far out of the Japanese culinary tradition. I mean, couldn't be further.
You think so? Absolutely right. It's true.
Now, you came back to Japan to do this documentary. Did you find anything that made you say to yourself, why did I ever leave Japan?
Yes, I did. I must say I did, although the truth is that though I made that film, I went back and made a bunch of other enterprises about American things, and that didn't lead at that point to an extended engagement in Japan again. But I felt happy to be there, and I felt nostalgic and even rueful, about having left the thing behind. I felt this even more powerfully, if you want to jump, I don't know, later when I went back in the middle of this commercial career that I sort of found myself in the late 80s. The National Gallery of Washington asked me to go and make a film about 18th century Japanese art, which I did. And at that point, when I began filming calligraphers and all kinds, I thought, oh my God, why haven't I been doing more of this? And that kind of led me in the direction that brought me here to UCSB, actually, in 1994, after about a 15-year hiatus from the Academy.
This is probably something that I should bring up. It'll shed light on the matter of your relation to Japan, but what Saul Bellow called you?
Oh, well, that's a very painful story that I did include in the book. Bellow came to Tokyo in 1974. I happened to be there at the time. I was, of course, in awe of Saul Bellow then and as a writer now. And I thought that novelists were the coolest people in the world anyway, and Saul Bellow was way up high on my coolest people in the world list. I was in a position in those days when someone like Bellow came, I was often asked to be his guide. And so I undertook to take Saul Bellow around as his Virgil in Japan for a couple of weeks, and he had a sort of rocky time, and his ego was getting in his way a lot, and so on and so forth. But we had a good time. I took him to my home, and I did this and that and the other thing, and got to know him quite well. And the day before he left, he said to me, John, you are the best squaw man I have ever met. And I didn't know what a squaw man was. And I said, Saul, thank you. What is a squaw man? And he said, a squaw man is a scion, wealthy scion of an East Coast American family who is suffering insecurity complex problems and who goes west and marries an Indian woman and sets up housekeeping with her in a tent on the reservation and in a teepee, and that's his way of feeling special. So I, of course, was married to Mayumi Oda in those days. So Bellow was telling me that I was living in a teepee with my Japanese wife in order to feel special, which, of course, felled me like a crowbar at the time. But in combination with the subsequent Katsu remark about you cannot win, that's what I added up and said, okay, I'm out of here. I'm leaving my teepee.
Do you think that Bellow meant to insult you, or was that just kind of a humorous jab? I can't imagine that being delivered in any way that makes it seem innocuous.
There is no way that it could have been. It was very deliberate. And all I can say, and I certainly don't want to speak ill of the dead and so on. Also, I think Saul Bellow was a great genius, that he was a very nasty fellow. And I have lots of evidence for that subsequently. And I think he just indulged in a kind of a mean impulse of the moment. Someone else listening to this would say, oh, Nathan can't even see that Bellow was right. Perhaps that's also true. But even if it was right, it was a very mean thing to say to somebody who had just spent 2 weeks, doing everything I could possibly do to make him give him a good time in Japan.
Speaking of Bellow and his type, a lot of very well-known people have walk-on roles in your memoir. There's Saul Bellow. I'm thinking of Werner Herzog, Stuart Brand, people like Roy Scheider, Sandra Bernhardt. There's so many that just cross your path, and I wonder what effect that had on you, is that the perception of celebrity culture to you, meeting so many of these people that didn't always show their most beautiful side to you.
I don't really think that after all, I'm a pretty old guy. I've been around for quite a while, and so it's not surprising that I've met a lot of people. I mean, there are many people that I feel very fortunate to have not only encountered in a passing way, but to have spent time with, people like Barney Rossett, for example, the great octogenarian publisher, founder of Grove Press, and so on. Some wonderful writers and so on. I mean, the Hollywood bunch never struck me as being that interesting compared to the writers, for example, whom I much prefer to spend time with. I mean, I do feel, looking back on my life, that I've been very fortunate, and it's been a very rich experience for me. I've had a chance to meet a lot of wonderful people whom I look up to, who taught me a lot and who inspired me to behave in ways that I might not have been able to think of doing otherwise.
The very title of your book, Living Carelessly in Tokyo and Elsewhere. Carelessly, that's no mistake that word is there. Why that one?
A friend of mine who just read this book and who knows me quite well, but whom I haven't seen for a long time, said he was really struck by the melancholy irony that runs through it. I mean, there is a fair amount of rue in this book, which is what I feel about my life, I guess, when I look back on it. And I feel that I have lived carelessly, not meaning insouciantly, by the way, but meaning without paying appropriate attention to things that should have mattered more. That's how I think I would define what I mean by carelessly. This is going to be a real problem in Japanese. It's very hard to translate this into a decent title. I'm going to have to use something else, as a matter of fact. Hopefully, I'm hoping to get this into Japanese. It hasn't happened yet. But in any event, I mean, I tried to tone down the mea culpa to the extent that I can. Nobody wants to read somebody, putting on a hair shirt and so on and lacerating himself. But there is a lot of regret in that book. And when I say living carelessly, that's what I mean. I mean, I think I have lived carelessly.
You lived carelessly to the extent that you focused on certain things despite what was more important at the time. What was it that would draw your attention away from the more important things?
Well, when in this case, I mean, talking about more important, I'm mostly talking about relationships, people that I didn't treat with appropriate respect or care, or relationships that I let come unstitched or undone. I could extend that, actually, without getting into some kind of a hugely, abnegatory spasm here. I think my life has been more or less thrown, which is a word, I think Werner Herzog, the founder of Est, stole it from Heidegger. But in any event, it means, not really planned or I have lacked a certain kind of continuity in my life, which I think has cost me a lot. I look at people I know, for example, who've been married for 45 years and lived in the same house in Cambridge, Harvard friends, or wherever. And I think that I and my family, we've moved maybe 40 times in that same period of time, between California and then Boston and then back and here. So, continuity is, I think, a valuable thing to have, something I did not obtain. And I feel that now perhaps I value it much more than I ever did before, so that's good.
There's a phrase you use in the book that stuck with me. You talked about your unceasing efforts to undermine yourself. Is that literally true? Were you unceasingly undermining yourself in life?
Well, now we're starting to sound a little bit like, an armchair psychiatric session. I don't think that I've been aware of that, but I think recently, as I look back, I can, in fact, identify certain, what I would just call self-destructive tendencies of my own that kept me from achieving, the kinds of levels and things that I would like to have achieved. Yeah, I would say that's true to some extent, yeah.
So why is this the time to write a memoir? I mean, you've got books in you, you're working on books still. It's certainly not the end of a career. Why the memoir now?
I've been working on this. I wrote it fairly quickly once I got it really started. But, it's been a good 4 years now. After I sold this book a year ago, it's been in production for a year. So it's maybe close to 4 years that I've been dealing with it and working on it. Why now? First of all, one feels one's own mortality, closing around oneself as you approach 70, which I'm doing. I've had some difficulties at home with my kids and so on that made me feel, I think this is actually a foolish thing to feel now that I've done this, but at the time I felt, I want my kids to have some kind of a more positive sense of me than I felt they had at the moment I began writing this book. So it was a kind of a gift from me to them. I am still able to write. You say, well, why now? I mean, you get to be a certain age, you think, well, who knows next year whether I'll be able to write this or not.
It's true, true.
So it just felt like the time that I wanted to do it. That's all I can say. It wasn't like I should wait because I'm going to do some more cool things that I can get in there or whatever. It just seemed like now was the time to do it. And I'm very glad that I have done it. And one of the things that I'm most grateful about is that it has already served me as a kind of bridge across my past to reach out to people whose acquaintance I've let drop and want to renew. I mean, there are a lot, I can send this to people who get a special pleasure out of it and use that as an opportunity to kind of reconnect with them. And I'm very grateful to have it for that reason.
And that's the theme of the book, is letting connections lapse, something we all do.
Well, that's carelessness. You see, that's the carelessness in the title, letting connections lapse. Turns out, the older you get, the more poignantly you understand that letting connections lapse is not a good idea.
Have you already got some people from your past back into your your circle
I
because
have.
of this book? Wow.
I have.
And it's brand new, so
That's
right.
Quick. Well, for example, in the early chapters of this book, a Japanese fellow named Kenji Naito appears, who was this wonderful young guy whom I first met at my post-Harvard job at Nomura Securities in Wall Street before I came to Tokyo, and I hadn't seen him for, 30 years. And this fall, I went to Tokyo, and having written about him, I wanted to reach out. I reached out to him, and we became very close again. I sent him this book. He was very moved. I mean, that's an example, and I could actually give you 20 examples of that. On April Fool's Day, I'm going to be speaking about the book at Harvard, which is a place I always love to go back, and the Reischauer Institute has invited me to be there. And that night, I'm going out with my wife and I and my daughter and son, my whole family, are going out for dinner with 6 other couples, all of whom were my former Harvard roommates. I haven't seen some of them actually in 30 years.
Wow.
And several of these guys are very illustrious guys. Now, I can't tell you how and I was able to send this to them and say, here I am, and, I'm coming, and let's get out. So it sort of helped me unstop whatever it was that had clogged some of these connections. And it's a great thing to have. If you write a book about Mishima or Japan, it's very different. This is a book about me, so it's like showing someone a mirror or something, or giving them a portrait. I don't know how to describe it, but it works very powerfully.
I talk to people about entering into creative endeavors, and they always say one of the main rewards is that the works will connect you with people. And it sounds like this one has more of that going on than even your average. If you write a novel, you'll find some people, but if you write something about yourself, this is going to have those people in it, and that'll be another draw for them, won't it?
Exactly. And, of course, actually on the downside of that is the people who are not in it. And, I originally wrote this, quite honestly, not even imagining that it would be published, because I thought memoirs are hard, and I'm not a famous guy, so why, and I'm very, very, very thrilled that Simon & Schuster took this book. But, when you write, that way, you're not in consideration about anybody particularly, and what comes out is what comes out. And I was conscious of people in my life who did this and that. Somehow I didn't know what to write about them. And now, of course, I realize that there are people who are going to get this thing and go right to the index and find themselves, not there, or there in a few lines, and are going to feel neglected, overlooked, hurt, abandoned, angry. Who knows? Not to mention the interesting aspect having to do with one's family and how you reveal the family and what the family feels. And I've had already a lot of stuff around that issue, and having shown the family sections and seeing how it goes down with them and so on. It's a very sensitive thing.
It seems to me that a writer of any memoir would ask, and some admit to this, they ask themselves, what are people going to learn from my life? And is that a question you asked yourself, thinking of what people might learn from your life, any reader of the book that you know or don't know?
Honestly, the answer would be that consciously, I don't think I ask myself that question. I think the question that I think it's not so much a question as it is a conviction of some kind, was that there are things about my life which brought me pleasure or understanding or pathos or something which I've always wanted to share with others. That's, all my movies are all about that. And my books too, in a sense, in my desire to bring out and give you something that I've had. Whether you're going to learn from it or something or not, maybe, I don't know about that, but I think if it moves you in some way, then that would please me. And I think what I ask myself is, are there things in my story which others will find moving, beyond just interesting? So is that the same as learning? I don't know if it is, but I don't frame the question quite that way. I frame it rather in some kind of an emotional way. It's just something which will move them the way it moved me. And I hope it does, sort of. That's part of it.
Since you had an occasion to reflect on your life writing this book, I want to ask you, and this is a question that people usually respond, my kids, so I think I want to narrow it down a little bit. What are you proudest of in terms of your non-biological achievements?
Yeah. I think this is probably the best thing I've written so far.
Ah.
So I'm quite proud of it, I must say. I'm proud of a couple of my Japan films, like Farm Song and The Colonel. I think those things are not The Colonel so much even as Full Moon Lunch. I think these are really classic films that continue to interest and enlighten people who watch them 30 years after I made them. So I believe, it's 40 years, isn't it? 40 years after I made them. I think these things are valuable in that they do mean something.
Do you ever ask yourself, what if I never learned Japanese?
I haven't asked myself that. It's kind of unthinkable to me. If I never learned Japanese, I might be working as a shoe salesman today, and you wouldn't be interviewing me on the radio. I mean, I don't really know the answer to that question. It's one of those, that kind of counterfactuality is interesting sometimes, but it's sort of an academic exercise, isn't it? I mean, because what you're given is what you have.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting to me when I think of how narrow the separation between what would have become a huge digression. If that kid had been a Chinese kid at Harvard and written the Chinese characters, I have no reason to feel that I wouldn't have gone and watched Somebody Wonderful in the Chinese department, and that would really have taken me in a very different direction.
You go back to the original thing that caught your attention, and if that was any different, you think of that blossoming out, in a whole different way. It's a cliched idea, but it's a true one at the same time.
That's right. The stimulus changing even slightly could have produced a whole other vector, I think. Another way to think of that is mystics, unlike myself, would say, no, if it had been Chinese, you wouldn't have responded to it. You were supposed to be the Japanese. I don't know how much credence to put in that.
It's definitely tough to say, but in 2008 now that you've had all these experiences in Japan and elsewhere, how has your attitude toward Japan come along? There are times in the book that it seems like the best thing that happened to you. There are times it seems like the bane of your existence, that you're tied to it, or that you felt you were tied to it. I guess you weren't in the end. But how has your attitude come along to this point?
Well, the last chapter of this thing is called something like Disengagement, I think. And I really say that I felt a considerable abatement inside me of the passion that I had felt in the past for Japanese studies and for Japan itself and for living in Japan. And I feel a renewed interest in other parts of me that are undeveloped but are part of my legacy, certainly. The novel that I'm writing now, Hard, is about the Lower East Side of New York, which is where my roots are. And, I'm very interested in that world for the first time, really, in my life. I'm studying Yiddish for the first time in my life, and I've swung into another place where I feel a real affinity. I was with my 20-year-old son this fall in Tokyo for 3 months. I was teaching at an ICU, and he was actually living with me and attending classes. And he kept saying to me, "Hey, Dad, what has this place got to do with you?" And I must say, I said to him, Toby, that's a really good and a really troubling question, and I really don't have necessarily a great answer. Then I begin talking about things which are real, the sensitivity, the delicacy, the beauty of the story. But right coming down, he would look at this enormous, hulking New York guy, and he was saying, well, what is this all about? What are you doing here? And I've sometimes, I confess, in recent years, asked myself that question. What am I doing here? What was I doing there? I think I understand many things about why I was there. It's not clear to me that it's imperative that I be there now as once it was.
Now, you're a teacher here at UCSB. You teach classes pretty regularly, and you have kids of several ages. You're seeing a generation now that's very much into Japan, as we mentioned early on at the beginning of the interview. Being someone who was interested in Japan, kind of on the vanguard of that in America, what do you think of the way that Japan has become, for some American kids, and Japanese culture, Japanese stuff, become a refuge in some ways for certain American kids?
I'm not the best person, I think, to ask about that question. I mean, it seems to me, you're talking, of course, about anime and manga and some design elements and stuff like that. I mean, that's what it's about. Mm-hmm. You're talking about the otaku movement, where this year in ICU we had students from UC campuses. And a number of them, maybe there are 30 kids total studying in this program in Tokyo. More than half of them were, computer game and video game addicts and freaks, whose principal interest in Japan was this. And of course, I have a very strong negative reaction to that. And I conducted myself in this course accordingly. I said, look, I'm not going to. You guys want to study that, you study it. So I'm going to teach you wonderful things about Japan that you don't have any idea about, many of which are the fundament on top of which all of this other stuff that wows you stands. I don't know what to say about this. There's certainly a vitality in this kind of thing. I don't know whether these kids get as close as they might to the essence of what this is all about by approaching it through, say, manga or anime.
Do you ever meet kids you teach that are interested in Japan in the same way you were?
Good question. Yes, I do. And of course, those are the students in whom I feel, the most interest. They're sort of rare, I would say, but they're certainly there. Kids who are genuinely moved, sometimes in ways they can't even express, by something they're feeling about Japanese sensibility, Japanese culture, Japanese achievement, who just want to pursue it because they feel as though they sort of love it. And of course, those are the kids I look for. And I do have them, regularly, if in very small numbers.
What do you try to impress upon these kids who are interested in Japan in the very same way you were back in the early 1960s, now in 2008? What do you want them to understand?
I don't expect them to understand this or that or anything else specific. I try to suggest to them that if they are feeling what they are, that what they really need to do is to pursue the essence of that by learning more and more, so that they can get to a place where they understand what they feel and that they have reasons for feeling it. I want them to expand, usually, the focus of their interest, and I want them to deepen it. And I want them to learn Japanese well. I want them to work hard. I want them to learn to read. I want do all the things that I did in the process of sort of rooting myself in this very foreign society and culture.
The book, one more time, is Living Carelessly in Tokyo and Elsewhere. John Nathan, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BenAlthouse.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit ColinMarshallRadio.com.